If you already know these two verbs, then talking about stuff that you have already done is super easy. And even if you don't, it's still about one of the easiest things to do in German. Grüß Gott, hallo, schönen guten Tag, ich bin Billy Berger und das ist Bausteine zwei. Herzlich willkommen. Now, if you watched last week's video, this one up here, then you'll know that our system of tenses in German is actually pretty straightforward. We can use one of two tenses, one for things that have already happened and one for absolutely everything else. Now, today we are going to turn our attention to the past tense. Now, if you've already learned a little bit about the past tense, then you might know that there really is only one past tense form that we use most of the time, and it looks like this. Now, the hardest thing I think for people to get used to, people who know other languages like maybe for example English, is that the verb that tells us what actually happened is mostly going to be right over at the end of the sentence. And pretty much anytime you talk about what you did, for example, you'll be starting off your sentence with either ich habe or ich bin. Mostly we'll use ich habe, unless we're talking about where we went, but look, we'll come back to this at the end of the video. So starting with always ich bin or ich habe could, as you might imagine, quickly get a little bit repetitive, but it also makes it easier for us because we don't have to remember lots of different words. Let me give you some examples to show you what I mean. So let's enlist the help of my wife here, and she might say, for example,
Ich bin heute Morgen im Grünen gelaufen. Ich habe gestern am Strand den Hund gefilmt. Or maybe, ich bin am Wochenende mit dem Auto gefahren. Ich habe einen großen Kaffee getrunken. Ich habe eine leckere Pizza gemacht. Ich bin mit dem Hund spazieren gegangen. Ich habe zu Hause gearbeitet.
Now, in each of these examples, we're always starting off with either ich bin or ich habe. And then we just continue our sentence in the normal way with all the usual building blocks in the usual order. And that's of course where our Bausteine come in, our building blocks. We can say whether the person likes doing it, when they did it, how they did it, where they do it, and if we need one, of course, we can add in an object. But it's not until the very, very end of the sentence that we actually get to find out what happened. If I told you, for example, ich habe gestern Abend zu Hause meine Bücher, then I've actually given you quite a lot of information before you actually find out what exactly it is that I did at home last night with my books. I might have read them, put them into order, sold them maybe, or just, I don't know, cleaned them. And the word that tells us what I did with the books is our action verb right at the end of the sentence. But of course, it's in a special form. And it's one that generally makes it clear that what I did happened in the past. And this is what's called the participle. Now, it almost always starts with a GE. And luckily, most of the verbs that we use are regular, so coming up with a participle is pretty easy if you already know the verb. You just sandwich the stem of the verb in between a GE and a T, so you get something like this, for example, ich habe Brot gekauft. But some other verbs make life a little more difficult. Here I'm only going to mention maybe 3 or 4 kinds of verbs to watch out for. First up are the irregular ones. Most of these are still pretty recognizable and actually behave in fairly predictable ways. Now, since these verbs are irregular, they will generally signal this by having an EN on the end of the stem instead of the usual T. So we have sentences like ich habe das Buch gelesen or ich bin mit dem Auto gefahren, der Hund hat lang geschlafen, and so on. Other verbs are sadly, well, a little more annoying because there's often some kind of change to the stem of the verb itself, and a number of these are pretty common verbs, so we do actually need to learn them. Like trinken, essen, sprechen. Here we generally encounter some kind of change to the stem of the verb itself. Ich habe den Kaffee getrunken. Ich habe den Käse gegessen. Or ich habe kein Deutsch gesprochen. And the key here is really, I suppose, just to look up the verbs on a site like Leo so you can see if the participle is irregular or not. Our final group of tricky, but not really so tricky verbs are the separable verbs that we met in an earlier video. And if we're using verbs like Fernsehen or anrufen, which consist of 2 bits, then we just use the participle for the main verb sehen or rufen and slap the prefix on the front so that the GE gets nicely sandwiched in the middle. Now, the last lot of verbs to watch out for are these ones. Verbs that either have a non-separable prefix or end with ihren, because these don't bother with the GE. And a lot of the time they just have that nice familiar T on the end. A couple of really useful ones that might be worth learning are Ich habe meine Freunde besucht or Ich habe das nicht verstanden. Basically verbs that start with these prefixes here. If you studied maths, for example, then you'd say Ich habe Mathe studiert. Studiert because the verb to study, studieren, ends with that ihren we were talking about. And there are quite a few useful verbs that start in the same way, like these ones over here. So again, the key will be to think about the verbs that you use and that you need on a regular basis, and make sure you know what the participle is so that you can use it easily when you need it. But before we finish, let's go back to what we were saying at the beginning about starting our sentences with either ich habe or ich bin. Now, we said we were going to use ich habe most of the time, and ich bin only if we are talking about having done these things. Now, if you look at them closely, you'll see that they all represent ways of going places or changing our location from one place to another. The most frequent ones are probably gehen, fahren, or kommen, those sorts of things. But we also start off with ich bin if we say that things happened using one of the German words for to happen, or if we did things that involved, funnily enough, staying right where we are. And then there's the reasonably small group of verbs that involve what's often described as a change of state, which I don't think really makes an awful lot of sense without some examples. So we're talking here really about waking up, going to sleep, standing up, or dying. Well, we can think about, I suppose it's like a movement from the waking state to the sleeping state, the state of being alive to the state of being dead, those sorts of things. Now, as I say, there's not very many of them, so it's just worthwhile keeping an eye out for those. With all of these, we're going to start off our sentences with ich bin if we're talking about ourselves. And there's a lot of information in your textbook, Bausteine zwei, so I'd head over into chapter 2 and check this out. Also das war's dann für heute und auch für dieses Video. Ich wünsche Ihnen eine schöne Woche und weiterhin viel Spaß mit der deutschen Sprache. Und wenn Sie Fragen haben, melden Sie sich einfach. Ich würde mich freuen. Have a great week. And if you have any questions, just get in touch or drop a comment down below.